Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 4th of August, 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish, and I will be joined by live video Skype link by Mark Anderson from American Free Press. Well, I'm delighted to say the sky is blue here in Plymouth. We've got quite a bit of sunshine, so maybe there's a little bit of end of summer or autumn. And what are we going to kick off with today? We should be starting in just a moment with the famous subject of beavers. And I did mention this to Mark a little bit earlier, which produced an early morning laugh from him. But let's have a look at what's going on, because UK Column, of course, has been warning about the terrorist beavers causing problems with climate change. Not our words, but the Daily Telegraph, mainstream UK newspaper. And now the Courier has caught up with this little article, and it says that the government, he's talking about the Scottish government, needs a new policy on beavers. So here we are. The truth emerges that beavers were reintroduced into Scotland in 2009. And it appears that people are not so happy with that decision because, of course, they're causing global warming. And now they're being accused of busting Brexit. So let's have a look at this. Apparently, the only valid reason for sitting on a decision to do with beavers is that the Scottish government staff have been struggling to develop a system of future management that complies fully with EU Habitats Directive legislation. And this is the bit post-Brexit. This is now meaningless because no one knows what's going to happen in the wider political world. So there we are, some consternation over beavers causing global warming, but also now such a problem to do with flooding even in Scotland that they're now saying the whole problem has upset Brexit. Mark, this is obviously a critical subject. What is your opinion as an American on beavers?
I fail to see their connection with global warming would be my first comment, Brian. What is the purported connection, just for the record, between beavers and global warming? What would that be exactly? What does the paper, the mainstream press in the UK claim here?
Well, this is going back about a year ago when the Daily Telegraph, one of our more intellectual UK papers, wrote an article, a serious article, and it said that there was evidence that ground squirrels and beavers were disturbing the surface of the tundra. And this was helping to release greenhouse gases, and that was contributing to global warming. I'm saying this with a straight face. The article was a serious article in that newspaper. They would have us believe that those nasty squirrels were active in the tundra and, along with beavers, were contributing significantly to global warming. I can't put it more simply than that.
All I can say is you would think they would be kidding, and yet you're telling me that apparently the press over there is not kidding. It just shows just how desperate they are to keep the global warming narrative, the one we're being told, alive. And how desperate they are to come up with headlines that might be grabby and might get people's attention, but really have no basis in scientific fact. It's amazing that people would take it seriously, or that the press would think that people would take it seriously. That's all I have to say on that for now.
Okay, well, we'll leave the happy subject to beavers there. But of course, it does appear that the press and media are using any and every subject in order to distract people away from what's happening that's important. Now, just before we give you a little bit of a free rein with subjects to do with America, I'll just introduce this one. And basically, this is Guido Fawkes, who's reporting on what appears to be full-scale war within UKIP. And this relates to a gentleman called Stephen Wolfe, but this is the key statement. If Stephen Wolfe is kept off the ballot for spurious reasons, I will declare full-scale war on UKIP using all the assets and sources at my disposal to topple the Tory establishment that is trying to take over the party. That's a warning and a promise. And many apologies. I've been caught out with some setting text creeping in there, so I'll apologise for that. But this is incredible stuff here, Mark, because UKIP, which should be in an immensely powerful position at the moment, for over 4 million people voted for UKIP. Brexit vote achieved. The party should now be in a really powerful position with strong leadership. What happens? Nigel Farage, the leader, steps down, and then here's the massive bust up. And of course, what this does as a minimum is make sure that all of that impetus goes nowhere. I don't know how well up on UKIP you are, but it seems to us that this is a deliberate undermining of all the people who have fought the European Union.
I would tend to agree. I mentioned on my blog, thetruthhound.com, recently that some see Nigel Farage, however you say his last name exactly, as having thrown the fight. As soon as Brexit is supposedly achieved, and Brexit is a lengthy process, Britain is still under the heel of the European Union yesterday, today, and tomorrow. It takes a minimum of 2 years to get out under Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, and it's going to take longer. And so Farage, whatever, didn't really achieve that much. Yes, the Brexit vote was in the affirmative, but it's only the beginning. It's filing for divorce. It's not actually getting the divorce from the EU. So right when the UKIP is needed the most, Farage throws the fight, as it were. And it really is a betrayal, or at the very least, he's just being very weak-minded about all this and giving up too easily. But it is a betrayal of many that depended on UKIP to be a real force in British independence.
Well, I'd thoroughly agree with that, Mark, and I would say that basically it's a task for everybody that's pushing out information about what's really happening to help those UKIP supporters re-engage and be doing useful things. The worst that could happen, of course, is that if we end up with millions of people who just don't know what to do because there's no leadership for them. So maybe some of that falls on us. But you've been writing on the subject of reducing government, and I was fascinated to see this headline on American Free Press under your good name. And of course, what the gentleman is saying, that we need to reduce government and we need to achieve a rule of law. And that is exactly what was discussed at the weekend just past by the British Constitution Group, where the topic was restoring the rule of law in UK. Tell us more about what you've got here.
Well, July 21st, Darrell Castle, the candidate for the Constitution Party of the United States, presidential candidate, spoke near Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I covered it. And he hearkened back to the Magna Carta of 1215 and spoke of that as the taproot for the rule of law in Western civilization. And it was very refreshing and interesting to hear a presidential candidate, although the media blocks him out, talk about the rule of law this way. And of course, how much Hillary Clinton, the Democratic nominee, breaks and flouts the rule of law, and also how Donald J. Trump, the Republican nominee, speaks vaguely of the rule of law, but doesn't seem to have any real knowledge basis or constitutional basis for what he says in that regard. And reducing government by 80%, as this headline shows, Brian, refers to Darrell Castle's view that if the U.S. government followed the U.S. Constitution to the letter, it would only be about 20% its current size. In other words, it would shrink by 80%. Now, one might argue a few percentage points either way or get into the brass tacks of that, and that maybe that discussion is for another day. But it's very refreshing to hear a presidential candidate talk about the rule of law, what it means, what a government following the rule of law would look like, how much smaller it would be. And yet I also learned at this Grand Rapids event where he spoke that the mainstream press in his hometown of Memphis, Tennessee, is treating him as if he doesn't even occupy three-dimensional space, as if he doesn't exist, even though his face has been plastered on billboards in Memphis for decades as a popular lawyer, a well-known lawyer in the greater Memphis, Tennessee area. So as soon as he becomes a presidential candidate in a third party or alternative party, he's persona non grata all of a sudden. And it's really sad in that sense because we need more people talking about the rule of law who would like to be public servants. And so just like the non-mainstream press like ourselves at times gets marginalized, so too do candidates like Darrell Castle also get marginalized. But their message, his message, is very important.
Very important message, and it's so interesting that if we look back to the reign of Prime Minister Tony Blair in UK, of course, he was the man who really pushed in what he called the third sector, the third way. And this was to produce a myriad of non-governmental organisations, many of them integrated with charities, immensely powerful, huge sums of money, billions of pounds at their disposal. And of course, that third sector has now stayed firmly entrenched in British politics, British government, if you like, the working government, and has been given increasing powers. So we are now consulting charities and non-governmental organisations prior to making wider political policy. And on top of that, of course, David Cameron has pushed home Saul Alinsky type big society. So this ballooning of the political system, I don't believe is accidental, Mark. I think that this is designed so that you end up with such a complex network that people can't really see where the policy is coming from.
Indeed, a labyrinth, a maze, if you will, and it makes it very difficult to monitor, let alone change, let alone to correct it.
Okay, and something else that we've talked about here in UK is election fraud, and you've posted this very interesting article on your blog, The Truth Hound.
Oh yes, election fraud. First, let me just make a quick preliminary statement coming out of the Darrell Castle discussion from a moment ago. One form of vote fraud is when voters don't hear about all the parties and all the candidates, and only on election day, when they look at the ballot, do they see all these extra names that they rarely, if ever, heard about in the press. So before people even get to the polling place to cast their votes, they're defrauded in the sense that the mainstream press doesn't tell them about all the parties and candidates, such as Darrell Castle of the U.S. Constitution Party. And that is a form of fraud. People are being shortchanged in that sense. But now what you're showing here from my blog, thetruthhound.com, Brian, is the next level or layer of vote fraud, and this is election fraud with computerized voting machines. And this article you're showing is a kind of warning to Donald Trump based on the views of Jim Condit Jr., who's a congressional candidate out of Ohio, someone I know, but I'm not talking about his candidacy so much. Jim Condit has a long history of monitoring and doing research on election fraud via electronic voting machines, which are down to just a small handful of companies, Diebold, ES&S, and Hart Intercivic. And some companies buy up other companies and absorb them, like big fish eating little fish, and you can read about it more on thetruthhound.com. But this is very, very concerning. And Donald Trump, to his credit, has, in more general terms, talked about, hey, this election is rigged. I'm telling you, this thing is rigged. The press is rigging it. He refers to rigged elections, but he doesn't get into the specifics of how these electronic voting machines have secretive source code that election clerks and election workers, public officials, are not allowed to look under the hood at. They're not allowed to look at the details of this. They're only taught how to operate the machines. But the secretive source code is what can be altered to steal an election and flip votes. And this has been proven by Houston, Texas, computer researchers and others who have looked at the source code and how it can be programmed to steal an election. And so this is kind of a warning to Donald Trump from Jim Condit Jr. Hey, Donald Trump, Trump campaign, this can be stolen from you, even if you're actually the winner in real terms. This election can be stolen. These machines can be the means to do that.
Mark, I couldn't agree more. I think it was Stalin who said it's not the voters that hold the power, but those that count the votes, or something along those lines. But of course, this is it. The moment the counting process becomes digital, who actually knows what goes on in the source codes in those algorithms between somebody pressing a button and ultimately their vote being counted. And we've seen, sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying correct, exactly. That's exactly right. The Stalin quote, it's not those who cast the votes, it's those who count the votes that decide elections. And the outcome between when you press that electronic touchscreen button voting for candidate X, but the machine interprets it that you voted for candidate Y. And when you vote on those machines here in the States, you can get a little receipt showing that you were there in the polling place and that, yes, you did vote, but you have no proof as to how you voted. And you cannot retrieve the individual voters' castings or input on that computer touchscreen. So once you vote, it goes into this netherworld, and they can't go back and say, Mark Anderson or Brian Gerrish voted on ballot number 245, and ballot 245 shows these exact votes for these exact candidates. They cannot show you that. It's irretrievable to the very best of my understanding.
And I can imagine that maybe some newcomers to UK Column could be saying, yes, but why would they do that? And my answer to the distinct possibility of vote rigging is we've only got to look at the pattern in UK where we've had postal votes lost, we've had postal votes spoilt, and then we can follow the career of some top civil servants such as Lynn Homer, disaster when she was returning officer in Birmingham, to the extent that the Electoral Commission described it as a banana republic. What happened to her after that? She was simply promoted and promoted again through transport, the Treasury, border controls, and ultimately pensioned off with a vast pension pot. So we're clearly seeing incompetence at best, but actually, is there malice? Many people would think so, to skew the voting system. And the other thing I'd just like to come back on as well is the media. And you are so right to say that, of course, if somebody is not part of the mainstream parties, then the media simply leaves them out of all reporting in the lead up to the election. As a small personal example, I stood as a candidate for Parliament, not the last election, the one before, and I was approached by BBC Radio Devon, who asked if I would give an interview. I said I would. When the gentleman arrived, this is for a radio interview, when the gentleman arrived, I said, well, how long have I got? And I'm nearly tempted to say to you on air, how long do you think? But I will tell you. He said 6 seconds. So I had 6 seconds to give my name, that I was an anti-corruption candidate. And of course, I was not given any time at all to discuss why I was standing on that very emotive subject. So the mainstream media consolidated and closed down so that other candidates don't get a chance. And Mark, several people have been digging into the very good research work that you can find quite quickly on Google, showing how American media companies, whether it's Time Warner or Disney, have all been consolidated into what are described as 6 super media companies. I don't know whether you can tell us a bit more.
Well, that's true. Summer Redstone and Rupert Murdoch are 2 of the big owners. There are others. It is down to about a half dozen. The number seems to vary because, as I say, big fish swallow little fish, just like in banking and with these electronic voting machine companies. And they have formed, though, as I mentioned in this truthhound.com article on my blog about, hey, Donald Trump, election theft is a real thing. They have formed a consortium, and that consortium basically tabulates and has the information on the total voting tally, the total votes in the U.S., like let's say in the presidential election, and the individual media outlets, according to Jim Condit Jr., and he can tell you more perhaps if you have him on your show, but the individual outlets that belong or comprise that consortium don't report their results until the consortium agrees that here's what the results are. So the media outlets in the States look like they're quasi-competitive with each other, but when it comes to elections, they collaborate.
Right.
And they have to agree on what the ground rules are, and they have to agree on the numbers collectively before individual outlets will give you those numbers. And this could use a little more research, but Jim Condit Jr. is one of the best sources on this, and he's the main one I quote in that article that you've shown here today on the UK column. So not only are there very few companies in the States, but they collaborate much more than they compete.
Right. And of course, the media has been accused of bias when we bring in the name Hillary Clinton. You've posted this article on the Truth Hound here, Mrs. Clinton's anti-TPP charade.
Yes, this is the next layer of the scam, and that is when the press acts as if a known dishonest politician and public official like Hillary Clinton, they act as if they can simply take her word for it at face value. In this case, when she says, all of a sudden, I'm against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is, of course, that largest multilateral trade deal in human history, involving 12 nations on both sides of the Pacific Ocean. And recently at the Democratic Convention in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, she was quoted as saying by the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, no less, that she said she's against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, although a few weeks ago she wasn't, but now she says she is, so it must be true. But in fact, people holding up signs against the Trans-Pacific trade deal, large placards at the Democratic Convention near the front of the stage, one was thrown out by his own party, and another was threatened to be thrown out unless he put his sign away. But what the press didn't show you was that there were dozens of anti-TPP signs at the Democratic Convention, and those pictures did leak out over the internet. But that's something that crosses party lines. There is a number of Republicans, rebel Republicans, that agree with these Democrats that these globalist trade deals are bad policy. This is transnationalism at work. It's not Democrats, it's not Republicans, it's the global managers, it's the Bilderbergers, it's the trilaterals and their operatives and deputies and water carriers throughout the political parties, throughout the press, and so on. And what I also point out here, Brian, is that the Arkansas Democrat Gazette is the establishment paper in the state of Arkansas where the Clintons cut their teeth on political corruption. This is where they grew up over the decades, becoming one of the most corrupt couples in U.S. political history. And so the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, of all papers, should know you cannot take Hillary's word when she all of a sudden does a 180 and says she doesn't support the TPP. It's not credible. She's spoken to the Council on Foreign Relations many times, as my photograph shows here, her speaking to them with my blog posting. And that's who her real cohorts are. Her real brethren in the political system is the CFR, and their sister group, their sibling, the Chatham House in England, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. These are Hillary's real allies. She's always been for the TPP, and she is, and she will remain in support of that trade deal, as well as the the Transatlantic Partnership, that trade deal as well, the TTIP. She is a stalwart supporter of those trade deals, and she always will be. And it's just really derelict that the press would accept her claims, which are obviously just political in nature, that she's against it. It's unbelievable that they would believe such a thing.
Well, we have to hope and keep encouraging people to get out as much information as they can by something other than the so-called mainstream media. Recently, when I tweeted out a little video clip that the BBC had interviewed Hillary Clinton, it was just laughable, I think the term is, at how little they asked her. So there were no pressing questions about emails or security breaches or weapons overseas. It was a massive BBC smooth the waters exercise. And I was quite surprised at the number of retweets that particular video clip had. Well, we're going to stay on an American theme, but we go to Russia today because this interesting headline has been put out on Russia Today. It said, ISIS wants loads of attacks in England, Germany and France. And this extraordinary intelligence has come from a jailed jihadist But this was in an interview with the New York Times. So Safaro, who is currently serving a 3-year term on terrorism charges at a maximum security prison near Bremen, recalled what one masked commander once told him. So we basically got the New York Times having a little quiet chat with somebody in prison who is simply saying what he was told. Hearsay, I think, is the correct word. And this has then been spun into the fact that we now need to be very frightened. We're going to be murdered in our beds in England. How is this possible, do you think, Mark, for a journalist to go and have a chat with somebody in prison? That might be quite difficult with a so-called terrorist. And then all of a sudden this is being announced as if it's major security anti-terrorist policy.
I'm not totally sure, Brian. What is your main concern again? I want to make sure I understand your question.
Well, basically, if you look at the article, which is warning us we're all going to be murdered by terrorist attacks from ISIS, if you look at the story as to where the information has come from, it's simply a New York Times journalist visiting a so-called terrorist who was in prison in Bremen. And he then says what he has heard, which is hearsay evidence. So we have a reporter visits a terrorist, and that suddenly becomes a major article which says we're all going to die in our beds in England.
Okay, yes, exactly. The veracity of that story should be immediately questioned. We have to take the journalist's word for it that this terrorist is in the know, that this terrorist knows enough to make these pronouncements that the reporter is telegraphing here, and that these pronouncements are credible, and that therefore this prisoner must be a very key member or knowledgeable member of the so-called ISIS network that would know, that would have the widespread knowledge and awareness to know that, as you say, Brian, that we're all supposed to be on the brink of dying in our beds from the great ISIS debacle, the great ISIS threat. But of course, we've questioned the credibility and the roots and origins of ISIS many times on this show. Some people have even come up with the moniker ISIS is ISIS-real. And that one's kind of funny, but there is definite evidence of the Mossad and MI6 and CIA having their fingerprints on the origins of ISIS. The U.S. Congress having funded the Free Syrian Army, many of whom mixed with elements of Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra, and basically coalesced into what we know as ISIS, or what's called ISIL or IS. It's had 3 or 4 different names, and they strangely have these long supply lines, unimpeded, unbroken, water, food, ammo, firearms, perfectly running, matching Toyota trucks stretching for miles in their caravans. The intelligence and military of our countries, our respective nations, the UK and US, should have a cakewalk cutting their supply lines, and yet ISIS seems to be unmolested in that regard. The whole thing is just not credible in terms of what ISIS really is. They're matching black uniforms in 110-degree desert weather, and so on and so forth. We really have to ask questions about ISIS at large. Therefore, prisoners like this and reports like this become all the more incredible, all the more difficult to believe.
Well, thank you for that, Mark. You've just given a brilliant introduction to the next couple of slides I've got. Now, I know you can't see video from us at the moment, so I'll talk through these and then I'll bring you back on and we can discuss some of the points. But you are absolutely right. What we have to do is start asking where this intelligence is coming from of this massive international terrorist threat. So I just call up on screen one of the earlier networks that we've covered. It's a little bit small, but I want to pick out some of the people, basically. We've got, of course, American intelligence working with UK intelligence, just highlighted with the arrow. So we've got the creation of Al-Qaeda in a spin-off of the Mujahideen, and who was training and equipping them? Well, of course, that was the US and the UK. Then we see transformation. We suddenly see this mysterious organization, Al-Qaeda, appear. But we've had British politicians up to some interesting things. So it was William Hague and David Cameron then Prime Minister, boasting that they were able to give so-called good terrorists several £100 million in order to help their good work in Libya. That seems to be helping to create terrorism to me. We had Malcolm Rifkin, who was chair of the Intelligence Security Committee. He was sacked because of some rather dodgy business dealings. So can we trust a word that came out of that gentleman's mouth? Well, many would say not. We had the Conservative MP Brooks Newmark. He falsely claimed that Assad had used chemical weapons when there was no evidence. The evidence circulated, be it from the US or the UN or UK, all said it was a possibility but not proven. And then, of course, Brooks Newmark was boasting that he told General Idris from the Free Syria Army that bombs and missiles would soon be raining down on Assad supporters. And he made big of the fact that al-Nusra was connected with ISIS. Well, of course, they were bad terrorists, but Brooks Newmark was having us rather believe they were good terrorists. I hope people understand this, because it can be a bit confusing. Some terrorists are bad and some terrorists are good, depending whether the British or the Americans are supporting them. And we'll bring in MI5 and MI6 and the JIC, which of course lied over weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And these are all agencies and people who would have us believe what they say about a terrorist threat. And of course, we'll bring back in the BBC at the bottom, because BBC propaganda has been ramping up the so-called terrorist threat. And their charity, BBC Media Action, has been boasting how it's been able to subvert the government of nation states such as Syria. Then, of course, we've got the Tory government that was boasting as how it's been able to link British and US intelligence into Israeli intelligence networks. And Minister of Transparency, Francis Maude, was at the centre of this, which was not only linking GCHQ into Israeli intelligence units, but we also had a linkage through British and Israeli universities. So my point here is that who are these people and why should we actually trust a word they say over a terrorist threat? If we look at what has been reported freely in the media, there are more than enough articles to say that we shouldn't trust any of the reports. And I'll also add to that, of course, it was a UK column with Vanessa Beeley in the first instance that started to talk about white helmets and the fact that although they were being promoted as a wonderful aid organisation, there was some actual dirty dealings. So if you have a look at the UK column, there's several articles to do with white helmets and dirty work in Syria, and I will encourage you to have a look at those. Now, this gets us on to the meat of the subject because, of course, having created this so-called dangerous international terrorist threat, all sorts of things can happen. So let's jump to Russell Square in London, and we've had a stabbing. The Telegraph, one of several papers reporting this, it says Russell Square attack witness, lots of armed police, lots of cars, and a body on the floor. And I've just made some comment there. Britain's police were trained to deal with stabbings 30 or more years ago, but they were not armed. So now we've got armed police being brought in on the streets, but it's on the basis of a stabbing. Well, not quite, because we've now got the launch of another 600 armed police in America, in London. And what is actually happening is that we're being told that those armed police are now on the streets as a result of Russell Square, well, no, as a result of terrorist attacks in Western Europe. So the comments from the police are that these armed policemen will help support newly recruited armed officers who will operate in visible roles across the capital to help reassure the public and deter any would-be terrorists. Members of the public across London will begin to see an increase in armed patrols, particularly in tourist spots, with an increased number of officers carrying semi-automatic weapons, tasers, and shotguns. So here we are with Britain in 2016, and it's very clear that not only are we moving to be a police state very quickly, those police are going to be heavily armed and many would say dangerous, principally to the British public. Here's Chief Constable Hogan Howe. These are some of the comments that he's made about this. He says, I think people understand that where you're going to have people as enemies who've got guns, we've got to have guns. Remember, he's talking about the police. There's been no public debate about this. He's adamant he needs more armed police. And let's have a look at these people. Very, very dark and sinister uniforms I've got on screen. Very dark grey with black, faces covered. And he goes on to say it's unusual, but it's an entirely rational and reasonable response to make sure that people are aware that we've got the guns. And if we have to use them, we've got people well equipped to do that. And on the particular picture on screen, Mark, I can tell you that you can clearly see one of these masked, heavily armed police is smirking, which I think says it all. We are starting to see a massive increase in armed police on Britain's streets. No debate with the public, no debate in Westminster, simply decided by top-level police officers behind closed doors with politicians. You, of course, have got heavily armed police on American streets and have had for many years, but we're now seeing even more heavily armed Homeland Security people coming in. There seems to be a distinct parallel between the UK and the US over this counter-terrorist policy. What are your thoughts?
Certainly there is a parallel, Brian. It's not exactly the same in the the US being such a large country. It kind of depends on where you're at. Washington, D.C., of course, there's armed guards on top of the Capitol building at each corner, fully automatic weapons, but that's in Washington, D.C. You go from Chicago to New York and you go to the smaller towns and it varies a lot. But the underlying thing in the States is the attitude of the police toward the population. You have a lot of ex-soldiers that served repeated tours of duty in the ongoing nonstop war on terror. And they come back and they don't seem totally deprogrammed. They seem to still look upon the population as a would-be enemy. So there's a mentality thing that goes on there. Of course, along with the fact that our post-9/11 police state agency, the Department of Homeland Security, gives a lot of military surplus gear to local police units in the United States. And one thing that isn't often mentioned, Brian, is that some police units in the States have been trained by Israeli outfits that are training them in the same crowd control and public control techniques that are used on the Palestinians. And this is something that's underreported or unreported oftentimes, even in the alternative press. We need not go into detail today, maybe for the sake of brevity, but particularly brutal tactics, tyrannical tactics are taught in that manner by those parties. But all that being said, it's very troubling that the ISIS threat, whatever it might be, is only surpassed by the police state threat that's in response to it. Who's going to kick your door in without due process or without a warrant? Is it ISIS or will it be your local army or police? Who is a more direct threat to your everyday freedom, ISIS or your own government responding to the so-called ISIS threat? So, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's the Hegelian dialectic going on here. And whatever the reality of ISIS might be, we still run the risk of tyranny. And the thing that people need to understand more than anything is that to the extent that terrorism is real, and we're, of course, debating the reality of it today, the goal of terrorism, the stated goal of real terrorists throughout history is to increase political oppression in the targeted countries. So if Britain or the States cracks down on our freedoms in our respective countries, that's exactly what the terrorists want.
Mark, I could not agree more. We're seeing this unfold in front of our very eyes. The constant excuse is terrorism, but who's going to be kicking down our doors? Who does kick down our doors? It's the police at the moment. And we can now see the stage where you won't even be able to see the faces of those policemen and women because they're going to be dressed in black with balaclavas over their heads and their faces obscured. Well, let's take this through a bit more because this is an interesting little heading that those nasty Syrian people are now responsible for a massive crime wave in the UK. So the Express here has this headline: police arrest 900 Syrians in England and Wales for crimes including rape and child abuse. And at the same time, we've got The Guardian here reporting that we've got fears over the number of asylum-seeking children who go missing after arrival in UK. Now, this particular article is talking over 300 children, Syrian children, just disappeared. But as we've reported earlier this week, European sources are saying that over 10,000 children have now gone missing in Europe, from refugee children, that is. So there is something extremely sinister going on here. We are the ones destabilizing Syria. We are the ones promoting the mass migration. And then those vulnerable children, we know, are not being protected in UK. But what is coming out in the media? Let's blame the very Syrians who've come here for refuge. And before I just ask you for a bit of comment on that, Mark, I'll bring in this one as well, because a lot of attention being focused on this lady, Justice Goddard, who is supposedly heading England-Wales inquiry into child abuse. She's apparently spent 70 days on holiday over the last year. Why is this significant? Well, she's paid £360,000 a year plus £110,000 rent. But she spent a year without hearing any evidence. And it's not going to be until 2017 that one of the key areas to do with the Anglican Church is going to be heard. So the point being made is that we're accusing the Syrians of abusing the children. We're paying a judge about £500,000 a year to conduct some form of inquiry. But at the moment, after 1 year, we haven't really achieved very much. So I'm going to say it's a cover-up to protect the British government. But you, of course, have also had similar cover-ups to do with the abuse of children in the States, particularly around Boys Town.
Yeah, the Boys Town story, boy, that'd be hard to get into today. I'd have to review some of that. And we had, of course, the Nebraska debacle, where John DeCamp, a Nebraska senator, spoke about a child sex network and child trafficking network involving the very top elites in the United States. And this Nebraska senator blew the whistle because it involved a credit union owner named Larry King in Omaha, Nebraska, who was helping shuffle these children around the country to serve the very unappetizing appetites of the elites. And if you can imagine your worst fears, they're realized here. But that being said, what you were saying, Brian, a moment ago, the U.S., the Western forces, the U.K., the U.S., we have this global hegemony. We have this notion that if you don't accept the neoliberal capitalist order and this corporate rule and this whole Bilderberg-inspired thing, that suddenly you become a target. Syria doesn't want to comply. No one is saying Assad is an angel. We know that there can be problems with his regime in some respects. But the U.S. forces go into Syria, we go into these other countries, we displace all these people. They don't know what to do. They flow into Europe, just like Mexicans harmed by the NAFTA free trade agreement flow into the U.S. through our southern border, And then we blame Syria, for example, on the abuse and dislocation of children being, knocked out of their homes, being forced out of their homes, driven out of their homelands, and into these rather unfamiliar Western-style nations like Britain, some coming over to the U.S. from the Mideast even, and then we blame them. And in fact, this migration, this mass migration, is a direct result of Western foreign policy and military policy, this stubborn interventionism we have, this notion that the U.S. can police the world no matter how bad the wages are, no matter how bad the consequences are. We keep pushing this interventionism, people that oppose it are shouted down as isolationists. It's the same old story over and over and over again. But the non-interventionist way, the so-called isolationist way, is the best way. It's the one thing we haven't tried, and that's to mind our own business and to stay out of these other countries' affairs and stop trying to topple every leader that doesn't agree 100% with our point of view. And if we would just come to our senses and look at it that way and stop shouting everybody down as isolationists and all these pejorative terms, all these put downs, we could actually turn the corner on this thing and solve this problem. But you know, our foreign policy is an anathema to peace. It's an anathema to prosperity. And our arrogant leaders and our press covers up for this stuff, and they keep carrying this stuff on. And so, you know, we're doing the best we can, of course, to set the record straight here today and in other broadcasts that we do, Brian, to explain what's really going on. But it is a debacle that this judge over there would be paid £500,000 to basically just kind of string this thing along and not really go anywhere.
Absolutely. Well, earlier in the news, you just mentioned the difficulties of extracting ourselves from the European Union. And we'll end on the subject of Cornwall here, a headline which immediately caught my attention. Let's bring it on screen. It's from the local Plymouth Herald. It says Cornwall Council could keep its Brussels office post-Brexit. Now, unknown to many people, local authorities in UK have had local offices, and Cornwall has clung on to its Brussels office. And why has it wanted to do that? Because it says it's continued to fund because it's a small investment compared to the amount of European Union funding it helps the council to oversee. So this is Cornwall absolutely addicted to the monetary handouts from the European Union. And we can see now how the European Union is helping to break down the proper structure of government in UK, because Cornwall Council, not beholden to Westminster in the traditional structure, but it's busy looking out to the side with its begging bowl to see whether the European Union will continue to put money into Cornwall. And of course, with the money comes the political control. Well, let's follow through with this quite extraordinary headline. It says, Man engine takes final steps as Odyssey heads west. And I'm going to highlight, this is a 10-metre high puppet, mechanical puppet of a miner, which has been marching through the countryside of Cornwall. This is one of the shots to show the sheer scale of it. What I found interesting is if you look at the faces of people watching it, they don't look happy. They look in a very unpleasant place. I encourage people to go and have a look at some of the photographs of the crowd. But this was fascinating. It said, tomorrow the Man engine will head to Hale for a show outside the Masonic Lodge at 7 p.m. So I'm not sure what the connection is there. But what is this monster? Here's a picture. So imagine that, 10 meters high. This is a pretty big piece of equipment. It's obviously cost a vast amount of money to build. And where has that come from? Well, let's come through to Cornish mining, because a big advert for the whole event on this site. And what is Cornish mining about? Well, if you dig into the background, you'll find that it's in partnership with UNESCO. And everybody's been very excited because UNESCO has said that a big chunk of Cornwall is simply to be a museum, because the mining represents world heritage. And so there we are. There is the brochure talking about how everybody is now following the rules laid down by UNESCO, and big chunks of Cornwall no longer to be put in productive use. So this is the UNESCO Management Plan, first revision of a document accepted by UNESCO in 2006 on inscription of the Cornwall and West Devon mining landscape as a World Heritage Site. So part of England simply becoming a museum piece for the UN, 19,710 hectares, just an astonishing amount of land. Yes, much of it of historical value, but why should this be under the control of the United Nations? Well, it says that it's going to be protected, conserved, presented and transmitted to future generations in line with obligations set out by UNESCO. And you should have a look at them. Very interesting site. What have we got? An anglia fit. Sorry, I can't remember the name of this fish. It'll come to me in a minute. I should do. But basically, it's a fish with a little light which attracts other fish to the light. It then eats them. An anglerfish. That's right. So they're going to look at how they can put world heritage into the high seas. And so the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization is going to be the intellectual agency of the United Nations, and it's going to help us build peace and sustainable development. And we're going to have the power of intelligence to innovate. Well, they've been thinking hard because they're working with Saudi Arabia to improve education. That should be interesting to see. One of the worst human rights reputation in the world. And if that's not good enough, they're going to help Pakistan develop by increasing the pop industry. I've got more cynical as I've got older, Mark, but the United Nations, UNESCO, I think are simply agents moving us towards a world government system, and they're after control of countries by any and every means.
That's true, especially in terms of land control, Brian. UN World Heritage Sites, of course, litter the U.S., especially to the west. The Yellowstone National Park, part of the great national park system here, is a World Heritage Site. And it brings about real changes. For example, my understanding from an editor I used to work with in Indiana was that Americans' gun rights, their Second Amendment rights, die at the door, at the gateway of the Yellowstone Park. And that is even in the face of wild animals, grizzly bears, and other dangerous animals where Americans are no longer allowed to carry firearms in that park, even when near these dangerous animals. And so you're put at actual physical risk, directly or indirectly, due to these World Heritage Sites and the related regulations. As you know, there's supposed to be very little molestation of the land wherever there's a World Heritage Site. The land, as you noted, is basically declared a museum piece, and therefore you can't have much land use of any significance. And I was just checking something just now. Even the famed Alamo here in Texas, only about 3 hours from me where I'm sitting, and we're in the, if memory serves, the 170th year of the Battle of the Alamo. It was in 1836, put it that way. And there's been efforts to make that a World Heritage Site under the UN. And Texas patriots, to a large extent, have a pretty big problem with that. So, yeah, the UN apparatus has been kind of pushed to the back or to the side of our discussions in alternative media in recent years. But the UN is still a big concern. We have to remember it was founded by John D. Rockefeller III. The Rockefellers donated the land for the United Nations on the East River in New York City. And it's a pro-abortion outfit, the UN. It believes in global depopulation. It believes largely that the world is overly populated. There are many people that will dispute that. They say, I think correctly, that certain parts of the world are overpopulated because we're being driven into the cities. And we've talked about the global cities movement through Bilderberg and other groups on your show here, Brian. But I think it's conglomerations, as geographers and other scientists call it, conglomerations of people being pushed into cities and in certain areas of the world. But overall, the world is doing just fine and can easily support the population it has and many more. This is another viewpoint that never gets any airtime on the mainstream press. And Paul Ehrlich had that book years ago, The Population Bomb, claiming we were all going to starve to death. According to Paul Ehrlich, I think this professor is still alive. We should have all starved to death or died of thirst decades ago, and we're still sitting here.
Yeah.
And so, there's a lot of this Malthusian outlook. We have the Georgia Guidestones in Georgia near the South Carolina border, kind of a second Stonehenge that says the world's population should be reduced from its current level of 6 or 7 billion down to about 500 million. Just exactly how would the global managers go about reducing the population by 70, 80%? Exactly how would that be done? But of course, it's all based on that UN-inspired myth that the world is overpopulated and we have to have these World Heritage Sites, and these sites should have very little human activity, as if human.
And at that critical point, I think we've got Mark back again. Okay, just a few more seconds to finish off, Mark. We've just got you back.
Oh, we had a blip there?
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
Oh, well, I was just saying, yeah, the UN Heritage Site thing, minimal human activity wherever the World Heritage Site Declaration is made. As you say, it can be huge amounts of land. It comes from the Rockefellers founding the whole United Nations and the whole global depopulation agenda of the Rockefellers and the United Nations that they helped found. And the World Heritage Sites calling for very little human activity on those sites. It all goes hand in hand in this anti-humanity kind of outlook where humanity is seen as a blight on the planet based on the exaggerated claims that the world is overpopulated.
Yeah. Okay, Mark, thank you very much for joining us, and thank all our viewers and listeners for joining us today. Obviously, much afoot in politics, whether it's happening in UK or the USA or further afield in the world. What do we need to do? We need to tell the truth about what's happening. We need to expose what's happening. We need to explain what's happening. So if you like what UK Column is doing, perhaps you'd recommend us to other people, or maybe you even know journalists or people involved in media who still don't know about UK Column, and get them watching as well. Talk to other people. Don't be put off when you're rejected. Simply move on to somebody else and sow those seeds. It's up to us what happens, and we need to act if we're to stop what is clearly the closing down of many democracies around the world. Mark, thank you very much for joining us. That's it for today. We will be back at the same time tomorrow with David Scott from Northern Exposure. Thank you. Bye-bye.